A recently released report by Oxfam called Survival of the Rich says that 2/3 of all wealth earned since 2020 was earned by the world's richest 1%. Yeah, Oxfam is calling for higher taxes on the rich to fund the eradication of poverty, inequality, as well as support efforts to address challenges caused by climate change.
Oxfam's Survival of the Richest report was released on the opening day of the World Economic Forum in Davos, where the world's business and political elite gather as wealth and poverty have both seen dramatic increases for the first time in 25 years. Oxfam International Executive Director Gabriele Boucher says 2 years into the decade, the world's richest have seen unprecedented gains in wealth, while ordinary people are forced to make sacrifices on essentials such as food. She says higher taxes on the super rich and big corporations is the door out of today's overlapping crises. The report says since 2020, 63% of all new wealth, $26 trillion, was captured by the richest 1%. The rest of the world has accrued half of that. As the world saw rapid rises in food and energy costs in 2022, 95 food and energy corporations saw profits double, with $306 billion in profits and $257 in payouts to shareholders. X's corporate profits have been fingered as the driver of at least half of inflation in Australia, the United States and the UK, with 1.7 billion workers globally living in countries where inflation is outpacing wages. The World Bank says we are seeing the biggest increase in global inequality and poverty since World War II. Roughly 1/10 of the world's population is going hungry. Women and girls make up nearly 60% of this number, as they are often forced to eat last and the smallest portion. Many nations face bankruptcy, with debt repayments to creditors making up more than 4 times spent on health care in the poorest countries. 3/4 of the world's governments are planning spending cuts of up to $7.8 billion over the next 5 years on critical spending such as education and healthcare. To address the dire situation, Oxfam is calling for a systemic and wide-ranging increase in taxation on the super rich. It says taxing the super rich is the strategic precondition to reducing inequality and resuscitating democracy, that it needs to be done for innovation, stronger public services, happier and healthier societies, and to tackle the climate crisis by investing in the solutions that counter the insane emissions of the very richest. Oxfam calls for the introduction of one-off solidarity and windfall taxes to end crisis profiteering. A permanent tax increase on the richest 1%, which includes at least 60% of income from labor and capital, is proposed. Governments are encouraged to focus on capital gains, which are subject to lower tax rates than other forms of income tax. With such taxes implemented, advocacy groups say $1.7 trillion could be generated per year. That's enough to lift 2 billion people out of poverty, fund humanitarian efforts, help deliver on a 10-year plan to end hunger, and assist poorer nations ravaged by the effects of climate change.
Kwesi Obeng, Oxfam's Regional Program Advisor for West Africa, joins us now. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. I'm still trying to get my head around this figure, that 2/3 of the wealth created in the last 2 years has been enjoyed by just 1% of the world's population. That is enormous.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's enormous. And I think the tragedy is that it's happening at a time when the world is actually in the middle of one in a century pandemic, the COVID pandemic, coupled with, the food, as the earlier report indicated, the food and energy crisis. So at no time it's anything of this sort, stuck than this time when we have multiple crises facing the world. And yet we have a tiny minority. And this time it's a tiny fraction of the world's population, less than 1%, basically appropriating the wealth of the whole world against the 99% of the rest of the world. And we're living in a space where we claim to be governed by norms and rules, and it's not working in favor of the majority of the world's population right across the earth. And so these figures just point to the failure of governments to address the needs of the majority of the people, and basically servicing the needs of the tiny minority of this world in terms of the richest of this world. And And I think that, as you're right, your report also indicates, it's not as if governments really are incapacitated or don't have the ability to respond to this, this state of affairs. They have the means, and some governments are actually moving in the right direction in terms of fixing some of these anomalies that we just referred to, in terms of just having 1% of the world's population basically appropriating close to 70% of the wealth made over the last 2 years, particularly in the middle of this crisis that we're still grappling with. Peter.
So, inequality has been with us since the beginning of time. These kinds of disparities don't happen overnight. Have we been noticing and ignoring over time what has happened, or has the inequality begun to accelerate in the last few decades, perhaps?
Yes, exactly. So if you look at it, even the tax structure of the world as we speak, as recently as the 1970s and early 80s, you take an example of the US. I mean, the top tier in terms of tax were paying close to 60 to 70%. Today, it's basically been watered down right across the world. It's part of the neoliberal watering of the tax system, such that those who have the ability to pay basically have been left off the hook. And that is why inequality has exacerbated, particularly in the last generation. And it's actually worsened in the last 40 years, 42 years, made completely out of range and out of touch. It's such a huge bonanza for the tiny minority, particularly in the last two to 3 years, particularly since the COVID hit. And so the point we are making essentially is that inequality is out of this world at the moment. It's never like we've ever seen before. In fact, according to the World Bank, in just 2020, we've seen close to 26 million people, at least in West Africa, basically sinking below the poverty line. And across the world, even as we're having, for example, this inordinate amount of wealth in the hands of a tiny few, close to 1.7 billion people, workers, basically are having to live in countries that are seeing wages plummet as inflation goes up. Basically, their cost of living is on the rise, and they are unable to provide the basics for their families. That's more than the population of Africa. That's 1.7 billion of the world's population. And so you juxtapose that against the 1% of the wealth that basically have accumulated 67% of the wealth created. Just to give you some more statistics, what it means is that the richest 1% basically made $1.7 million for every $1 that the poorest 90% makes in a day. I mean, that's how stark the figures are. But as I said, it's not as if there aren't solutions to fix the growing levels of inequality. There are solutions. And I also need to point out that the growing levels of inequality, particularly economic inequality, also has an intersection with gender, with race, and colonialism. So you look at the numbers, and the richest 1,000 people in the world, only 125 are women. And guess what? Only 5 are blacks.
Right.
The rest are all mostly white people, white men.
Which leads me into my next question then. I mean, I look at South Africa and we have record levels of inequality here. Is this the same picture across the continent, and particularly the continent when compared to the rest of the world?
Yes, unfortunately, the picture is pretty much the same. In West Africa, for example, and just to give you a case, countries like Burkina Faso, Ghana, these are all countries highly indebted, in debt and crisis. So Burkina Faso, Ghana, Senegal, Niger, nearly 0.1% have more than half of the wealth of 50% of the population. I mean, it's that bad. In Nigeria, for example, only 3 richest men own more than 80%, 83 million Nigerians in terms of the comparison with respect to their wealth. And we've seen the wealth of these tiny three richest Nigerians, for example, balloon in the last 2 years. And so the picture is pretty much across, not just simply the world, but across Africa as well. We have the same stark numbers staring us in the face, also on the continent. And that's why we think that governments, and particularly also the international financial institutions that have promoted these bad policies that have brought us here, ought to be brought to book to fix the current crisis that is facing the world at the moment.
Yeah. So your members have demonstrated at Davos. What can be done at Davos that would make a difference almost immediately?
Well, 2 things. One is that I think we need to draw the world's attention to the crisis of inequality. And the thing is this: no one is safe until everyone is safe. In other words, and the evidence, empirical evidence, points out that when you have inequality on the rise, it generates insecurity. In fact, even the wealth that the wealthiest have accumulated becomes insecure, that they cannot enjoy them. But 2 things. One is that there are solutions. And as I said, a number of countries are already making the right decisions. So take examples like Colombia and Chile are leading in Latin America and in putting out new policies to impose taxes on wealth and taxes on the wealthiest. And I think that, and your earlier report pointed to some of the solutions. One, in many countries across the world, capital is not taxed. And I'll give you just one example from Uganda. Uganda, there is this woman, a young woman, Amber Christine. She basically sells flour, and she makes about $80 a month. That's equivalent to about 1,350 rand a month. She pays 40% of that. That's about 540 rand in tax. One of the wealthiest men in the world pays less than 3% in tax. I mean, that is simply not fair, and it's not acceptable. And so, one, there are solutions, and one is that we need to get our governments to impose taxes on capital, capital gains tax, introduce more progressive taxes, taxes on wealth, on property, and the like. And the fact is that we've crunched some of the numbers, and it points out that we could raise trillions of dollars to actually address some of the systemic crisis facing the world. And the last thing I probably need to make a point out is that this problem is not because the richest suddenly woke up one morning and became smarter than the rest of the world, or started working harder than the rest of the world, or became more entrepreneurial than the rest of the world. It's simply a structural issue, and therefore it has to be addressed holistically.
Obeng, thank you so much indeed for highlighting this critical issue and giving us some insights. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, that's Kwesi Obeng, Oxfam's regional program advisor for West Africa, talking to us about Oxfam's latest report, which shocking statistics, 1% of the world's population have enjoyed 2/3 of the new wealth in the last 2 years. That's phenomenal.